conflicted, confused, and that does not make them ignorant. So I will not allow you to say that about yourself. Scott, followed by Jim.
Gary, you called me before I got on my computer mic, so I'm on my AirPods. I don't know if they sound that good, but I always
They're fine. They're fine.
AirPods are. I never like. I always like wired microphones. But. Well, Gary, where should we begin? Let's do a little theological education. First, last rites is really the sort of common term for holy unction, which is a sacramental rite that's practiced in the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. Some Episcopalians sometimes do it too. But it's also known as the anointing of the sick. It's where you use blessed oil to pray for the physical and mental and spiritual healing and forgiveness of sins and strength of a penitent, of a,
right. So if you can't if you cannot apply the oil, does it lack the substance?
Usually there would be accommodations for this. Like, there's this idea in Catholic medieval theology. What if someone wants to get baptized and there's no water? Can you use sand? Sure. Or what about if there's nothing to baptize? Well, there's the baptism of desire. So this is based, of course, on the
intent.
Right. Intent. James 5:14-16. So anointing of the sick, which is very important. I've done it for people before, and it's a wonderful thing to do. Also, I would like to take us to a little medieval theology. Martin Luther's Simo Justus et Peccator, at the same time, sinner and saint. This was, of course, a contradiction to the Catholic view that you're always kind of a sinner or a saint, right? That you went in and out of these the status, depending on whether you were good or naughty, and the sacramental system kind of cleansed you, but then you could lose that cleansing. And for people like Luther, who had a pretty sensitive soul, he was always worried that he was losing his salvation, that God was angry with him, and he came up with an alternative that said God's determination about us is not based on the inside of us and how we feel, but on his verdict outside of us, because we are all mixed bags at the same time, sinner and saint. Simon Justus et Peccator. So that's a long theological way of expanding and expounding upon your point that we are all flawed, right? That all of us, who, if we were put in the court of public opinion with all our warts, would stand. My friend, an Episcopal priest in New York, said that we're all 2 days and 3 bad decisions away from being a tabloid, or 3 days and 3 bad decisions from being a tabloid headline, and usually he's on day 2. So we're all a mess, I think, and I think we should give Dr. Fauci some grace for that. It's funny. I listened to one podcast. They said men should keep journals, not diaries. So that was sort of a blow. A woman said that, a blow from or for the manosphere, I suppose. But I think if any of us had kept honest diaries, is there such a thing as honest diaries? Because even when you're writing our diaries, if you're honest psychologically, you're probably imagining it. Right? So even then, we're performative, right? We're such complex human beings psychologically. Complex creatures. But yeah, I think that we should give Dr. Fauci some grace, like we should give everybody grace, because we're all complicated. And if any of us had some of our narcissistic tendencies exposed, it could be ugly, especially if the person exposing them had subpoena power and government authority and things like that. So that being said, Dr. Fauci told some fibs. He told some lies. I think that's clear, that he was not entirely truthful with the American people. Now, in his defense, people lie in offices like his, in situations like his. Why do they lie? He's not lying for great personal gain. He's not lying to protect himself from embarrassment. He was lying largely to avert panic, right? And because they didn't have all the facts. And so I think, does that excuse it? Maybe, maybe not. Or does it mitigate it? Certainly, possibly. But I mean, I think that I think we ought to have some sympathy for people who are trying to avert panic in a situation that is fast moving And we didn't know what the hell was going on. Nobody knew what the hell was going on, right? Including him. So I have some grace there too. I mean, for trying to serve the public's interest by trying to say assuring things, reassuring things, even as the great line from Top Gun said to Tom Cruise's character, Maverick, your ego is writing checks your body can't cash. So maybe he was writing checks that his ultimate reputation would not be able to cash down the road. But I mean, I do have some sympathy. I also think that despite Rand Paul's obsession, I like that Dr. Fauci called it an obsession, a byproduct of the obsession is we got some facts out, right? This is part of the nature of the adversarial system, right? We have an adversarial system that is populated by sinners. Reinhold Niebuhr said the only empirically verifiable Christian doctrine is original sin. You don't even need a God to prove the original sin. Just look at, spend a day in New York City like you do, Gary. You'll see some foibles of people, or just get married or something, right? And you'll see that we're all sinners. We all have our dark moments. And the fact that maybe Rand Paul was obsessive doesn't change the fact that the adversarial system was an outlet for his obsession and got us some truth about the nature of what really happened in the pandemic, and truth that's valuable so that we can have it to reflect on when the next pandemic hits, which inevitably will hit. I don't know when, but these things happen. Nature evolves. We're getting a more and more populated world, and we're doing more and more interesting things with therapies and genetic manipulation. We're going to have more pandemics, and so we benefit from this knowledge. I wish it could be more charitably? Yes, I wish our public discourse was more charitable. I wish our clubhouse discourse was often more charitable. But we're dealing with flawed people, and so, but that, I mean, in some sense, the flaws were to an advantage. Just like I think there'll be an advantage to their flawed Democrats that if they win the House, will use the mechanisms of the House to do hearings and oversight. And will that all be done from pure motives? Will some of it be done because of just ire for the president? Of course. Yet that ire won't invalidate any truth that gets dug up or any mitigating of some of the autocratic impulses and tendencies of the president. So, yeah, I think that on some level, despite the fact that I think things were a little rough on Dr. Fauci, I'm glad we have an adversarial system, because we need to, in a democracy, we need to debate these things in the light of day. We need an informed electorate, and this serves to inform the electorate and serves to inform us and inform our choices about who we will vote for. But now maybe we'll start asking people in debates, what would you do during the next pandemic? How much authority do you think the government should have to shut down things like schools? And what do you think what impact do you think that has on our mental health collectively as a society? These are questions worth asking. And I think that Dr. Fauci, and I'm somebody, look, I'm a pro-vaxxer. I'm not anti. I go to CVS and just say, what vaccines can I get? I love vaccines. I just went in the other day. I was walking by. I actually walked in. Now, it does maybe has something to do with my pharmacist. It's very cute. But I asked her, what can I get this week? And so I am totally a pro-vaxxer. But I think it's worth debating the stuff in the light of day. So what is Dr. Fauci? Is he a public hero or a public health hero or an evil scientist?
What's the nation?
I think he's a human being. I think he's a human being who, because of his position, deserves some scrutiny. And that scrutiny, I think, will benefit us in the short and long term. And he's also someone, that deserves some grace. He had a complicated job, and I think he was trying to execute that job in a way that wouldn't cause panic in a situation that was moving incredibly fast in real time. So I have some grace and sympathy for Dr. Fauci. At the same time, Gary, I'm grateful for an adversarial system that gets this stuff in the light of day. That's longer than I usually speak. So I say, good day, my friend.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, and I know you touched on this very briefly, But the tone of this inquiry makes it not, in my opinion, an attempt to get to what we have learned, the lessons learned, so we don't make the same mistakes the next time there is a pandemic from an adversarial standpoint. This was obviously an attempt by Rand Paul et al. To embarrass and to box Fauci into some kind of a corner where they could take some kind of action against him. And that is why he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. And that in itself prompted them to take some kind of action against him. If you had the opportunity to listen to any of that hearing, you will know that the witness was being badgered, and badgered. And profanities were hurled at him by United States senators. They weren't inquiries that said things such as, Dr. Fauci, could you please explain why you are so certain that this was not a virus that escaped from a laboratory that the United States co-funded in Wuhan, China? Or even a stronger question along those lines.
But
no.
Gary, I hate the fact that you can't say it was in a lab because you're racist or something, right? I mean, it's one of the things that I find nauseating, that somehow this became identitarian, right? That if you said it was in the lab, oh my God, you're a racist, you know? I mean,
well, if it happened in the wet market, does that make it a racist comment? Obviously, we have to observe what's happening and describe it as it is. It's not racist to describe a fact. It's racist to make up a fact. If you're reporting that a person committed a crime, and this is a person that you're on the lookout for, and when you give the description of the person, you include that person's race, and if it happens to be in an Ohio town and that person happens to be Haitian, and you say, hey, a Haitian guy just robbed the bank, that's not being racist. But if you say Haitians in this same town are kidnapping people's dogs and cats and cooking them over the Spitfire, that is racist. So it's all about the context. So I personally don't have a problem with saying that there are questions that are being raised about the origins of the virus. And one of the theories, and that's all it is at this point, is that it was manufactured in a lab and somehow got out, and that lab happened to be in Wuhan, China. I mean, for God's sakes, they were hit hard by the pandemic before we were. So it's not as if the Chinese created a biological weapon to turn against the United States, unless their intent was to test it on their own people first. Maybe that's the case, but I mean, I think that's pretty far-fetched.
I will say now, it might be racist to call it the Kung Flu. I think that.
Well, look, part of the problem is, and again, going back to my point about tone, when the president referred to it, he referred to it as the China flu, but he didn't just say China flu. The inflection of his voice when he did it, which you're far more astute at doing this than me because you got the president's inflections down pretty perfectly, I believe resulted in Asian folks, even people who are not Chinese, getting attacked on the streets of the United States, and particularly Chinese people in areas of high concentration of Chinese like Manhattan and Queens, Chinatown, where it occurred. Because of the way it was being presented. It wasn't that. We have to look into whether this flu, and we believe that it did, began. That's not how the president presented it. So he put people at risk through his dog whistling once again when it came to how he approached it. That could be viewed as racist, in my opinion, anyway. Simply stating that it may have originated in this lab and questioning whether it originated in this lab is not racist. It's all context in the manner in which you do so. What happened at that hearing was not an honest attempt by the Republicans to, by the way, Fauci served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, including under President Trump. So I don't know, again, how this becomes partisan, but it was adversarial and fine. But there's a way to do it if you are a seeker of knowledge and truth. It's another way to do it if you're trying to embarrass the guy and make him out to be a public enemy so people can go around saying, see how Fauci is? He's an evil scientist. He's a criminal. Two different things. So that's my real objection. I don't have an objection to them holding a hearing, but Rand Paul's public pronouncements have been pretty darn clear that he wasn't hoping to hear from this esteemed scientist his opinion about what happened with COVID and debate it. That wasn't his intent. The manner in which he approached, and several other senators approached Fauci, would get him kicked off the stage in the critical thinking forum. And yet it was allowed in the United States Senate. Okay. I guess if we want to explore the origins of COVID, the better forum would be here than there. What do you think? Maybe we should ask Anthony Fauci to come here and we can ask him all the questions we want in a manner in which it's not an inquisition.
It better not be disingenuous.
I won't be disingenuous, Scott. Jim, followed by Les.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I think that was very informative. I want to share, first off, that in my capacity as a lay minister for my church, that's not ordained, but in my church, we do several things like anointing with oil and prayer. And I've done it at Veterans Hospital. I've done it at conferences. I've done it at many different venues, with my training and experience by my denomination. So, and you have to take special precautions. And of course, me being blind, we worked out different protocols and things for me to be able to do it. But I did it successfully for 7 years, voluntarily. So, my question about Fauci, okay, in my professional, okay, outside of church, my secular job doing rehab and mental health, okay, the code of ethics for my fields, I'm responsible and accountable for some things for 5 years. They can come back, subpoena me, bring me in, do whatever, and say, okay, what did you do here and why did you do it? Some other things, it's 10 years. But at some point, and I've been out of the field now since 2015 formally. Now I do volunteer things, volunteer projects and things like that because of my education experience I'm allowed to do, but they're very tightly structurally governed because of my experience and education. But what I'm saying is as we know a lot with this administration and parts of this Congress, is they look backwards and it's revenge. This was wrong, and they waste a lot of time on what happened. What I want to know is this man has been retired. He's 85 years old. Now, I will say, I'll be honest and transparent. I am a Fauci fan. I also am a pro-vaxxer. And so, I've gotten everything that I could get that you get in the United States vaccinated for, especially being blind, because there were a lot of things, especially when I went to school. I went to school where there was the medical school was in the same building, other types of research was being done. And I wanted to make sure that as a person who's blind, if I accidentally touched something, I didn't go into labs, but there were open corpses, but we shared the same break rooms and the same bathrooms and stuff. And so I wanted to make sure that I was as protected as I could be. So my question in general, and I don't know if anyone would know the answer, is at what point can this man take solace and be left alone to retire in peace? At what point is he just done? We all make mistakes. I know that in my work, I'm sure I made mistakes. Sometimes they were pointed out to me on the job. Sometimes I learned even after I retired, oh, well, that project didn't go as well as I wish it would have, or this client did this. I've actually been in court a few times too, not because of things I did, but things clients did, and I had to testify either, on their behalf or to keep them from being, misprosecuted. So, I just want to know, he's 85, if I understand correctly. I did a lot of reading about him, plus I read his book, which I know is his book. But at what point is he no longer responsible for his actions for the job he did? And I just think, and I'm going to land the plane, that, where we are, any one of us, for whatever we do, say, or whatever, could kind of like what somebody was saying earlier, a few days from a tabloid. We had another way of putting it in my job. They said, anything you do or say, you could be on the evening news or tomorrow's front page. So be aware of what you write, do, and say. But, I just wonder when he can say, okay, you can't bother me anymore. I'm a private citizen. Why aren't we going back and still persecuting the people that were supposed to be over everything with 9/11? Because we had the investigation, we know, and it's awful, but Condoleezza and all those other ones aren't still being held up on pikes, and other people that were involved in things aren't still being harassed. They've been able to go on with their private lives. So I just wonder, at what point do these former people in administrations, when do they finally get their peace and they're able to go and enjoy their retirement and their life and not worry about what decision they made or what they did when they had this job some years ago that they're no longer responsible for? And that's where I land my plane.
The answer to your question is when it becomes no longer politically expedient to do so.
Thank you.
And you're correct, 85 is 85.
Mm-hmm.
Let's follow by Kitover.
So I'm not going to repeat all the things that Gary said. He saved millions of lives. And if you had to put him in in terms of percentage of people that have saved lives, he would be in the top 1%. Between HIV used to be an inevitably fatal disease. Now it's turned into a chronic disease. We also have all the vaccination that was done in the poor countries that have saved millions of people. And this is ongoing. In terms of the SARS-2 virus, let's look at the origin. Where did where do most diseases come from? They're called zoonotic. They originate in animals. SARS-1 was we saw every 10 years we're seeing another one of these coronaviruses that are emerging. First we had SARS-1, and SARS-1 has been found, it took a long time, but we found that it originated in these,
Birds.
from wild animal sources, and they were brought in by the truckloads into live wild animals, with were brought into these wet markets in cities that had 10 million people or more all over, and it emerged as a disease. MERS, 10 years later, we had that also a spillover from wild animals. And then we look at SARS-2, and we see that that is the case. We have, we've actually taken, this is in Science magazine, we've traced the cases of SARS early on, SARS-2, and we located where they are, and we've actually genotyped each one of these strains. And we can see that it originated from around the wet markets, and we have also have traces of that in the actual stalls where these live wild animals were kept. Now, there was a law against that, but it's a $70 billion industry. And people are going to break the law because $70 billion is a lot of money. And we also see we have two lineages, lineage A and lineage B, which meant there were two independent introductions into the wild animal markets. That's not something you see from a lab leak. A lab leak would be one. The odds are infinitesimal. Mr. Trump did a great job at funding the mRNA vaccines, but when he talked about it, he got booed, so he stopped talking about it among his supporters. Fauci, at the beginning, when no one knew that this was going to be a serious problem, he told them, well, let's just start working on an mRNA vaccine. We've got a sequence from somebody sent to us from China so he got the vaccine effort started immediately before anyone knew that it was going to be a serious problem. In particular, they wanted to do some sort of thing to see how well mRNA, to get to work with mRNA technology that had been worked on for other outbreaks and before that had kind of fizzled out. And what else? Did he do things perfectly? No, there was a lot of unknowns. Basically, what the mRNA vaccine did was it took the virus and it made it from wild to mild. It kept you out of the hospital. It kept you out of the morgue. It did not stop you from getting sick. But you didn't get so sick that you ended up in one of those two terrible places. And again, I think Trump was trying to deflect responsibility by blaming it on China. Now, were the wild animal markets responsible? And in some sense, could you blame that on China? Yeah, I guess you could. But I think Mr. Trump is doing what he always does, which is if he's got a problem, don't blame me, blame somebody else. And what else? In terms of mistakes that Mr. Fauci made, as people have said, SARS-2 was a novel virus. We knew that SARS-1 had a high percentage of mortality, and if we had something with SARS-1 mortality, but worked more like the common cold and spreading, we would have, basically civilization could be destroyed because the hospital system wouldn't be able to keep up, etc. I think in retrospect, the school closures were a bad idea because children weren't all that vulnerable. Certainly the, older teachers were, but, they should have worked around that somehow. And I could talk all day, but there are a lot of people that want to talk and have things to say. I'd love to hear from them. Thank you.
So, the Wuhan market, the suspect Wuhan market, is both a wet market and a live animal market. Wet markets are common throughout the world. They're not novel at all. Every nation has wet markets. Actually, every nation on earth permit the more risky live animal markets for standardized domestic livestock. I'm reading this from the World Health Organization, which of course, some people based on the president's condemnation of the WHO would say is not a credible source. But according to the World Health Organization, there's no official ban on the baseline concept of a live animal market anywhere in the world because it simply describes selling live fish, poultry, or cattle to consumers. The WHO does say that the legal landscape changes drastically depending on how the market is defined, whether it trades in domestic livestock versus live wild mammals. That's getting into the weeds a little bit. But the point being that if it did originate, and we don't know that it did, from that so-called wet market in Wuhan, well, then it could have originated from any wet market in any nation of the world. And does that make China more culpable because it may have originated within the confines of their country geographically? I don't know. Thank you, Leslie.
Can I just say something? The wild animals, it is very important that the wild animals we're talking about were precisely the kind of wild animals that brought SARS-1. And indeed, China did outlaw them. But in the 2010s, late 2010s, they were still kept there, and there were traces found of, in the stalls where they were kept. And the stumper is that you take these things from the wild, and you take a virus that would normally just die of loneliness because it is not in a city of 10 million people. And you give it a place to jump to and in a place where it can sustain an infection. That's not to blame the Chinese necessarily, but that's just to explain what happened.
It's like other things that are cultural. You can outlaw or regulate. It doesn't mean that people are going to change their habits. And there may be some enforcement, but it still doesn't eradicate it completely. Cockfighting is an example. Consuming of dogs is another example. Some things are ingrained in a culture, and as people get more information, about the dangers or the downside of the various activities. There are regulations put into place. The amount of enforcement is not uniform, and so things do happen. Again, we do not know to this day with certainty the origins of the COVID virus. We don't know for certain. King followed by Normal. Thank you, Len.
Afternoon, Gary. Good evening. I just wanted to enter in the conversation again. I have this thing about memory. Part of the reason that the children were kept home from school and there were school closures were not just because of older teachers, but because of the risk presented to multi-generational households. And since the pandemic, there have been medical studies that have been published in JAMA and other medical journals that kind of shed light on the percentage of COVID deaths related to older people who lived with, they were multi-generational homes. So
right,
I just
right. And to that point, I don't know in the aggregate if those communities which regulated in-person schooling, because this was not regulated by Fauci or the federal government,
Correct.
It was regulated by the individual communities.
Correct.
There were positives and there were negatives. One of the positives is what you just suggested. It mitigated the spread of the virus to elderly people living within the households of the children. But it also retarded the academic prowess of a generation of children. That's also been documented. I don't know in the aggregate whether one would say that those decisions made on the local level were positive or negative, because there are both positive and negative aspects of it. And that's well worth debating. And it's probably worth greater analysis than that I'm aware of, at least thus far. But that wasn't mandated by Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci et al. Made recommendations, and some of those recommendations turned out to be good. Some of them turned out to be that they were wrong. I'll give you one that was wrong, benign, but wrong. You got to wipe the surface of every package that comes into your house, because initially they thought that the virus might be transmitted through your Amazon deliveries or your Instamarket grocery deliveries. So people were spraying that stuff down with Clorox. Okay, no harm, no foul in that, but they were wrong about it. But they issued that recommendation based on the science as they understood it at the time, which changed as the virus progressed for two reasons. One, they got a better understanding of what the virus really was doing. And two, the virus mutated constantly. It's like when you go in the fall for your annual flu shot, it may or may not be as effective this year as it was last year, because the flu mutates, and sometimes it mutates faster than the vaccine can keep up with, and more people get the flu this year than got last year. So I don't know. I know that the kids next door are homeschooled. This is very anecdotal, but from what I can see, they haven't fallen behind. But I do know other kids their age who have. So again, that's anecdotal, but on the other hand, you know, the kids that were homeschooled didn't bring home the virus to their parents. You know, I don't know that there's an answer to that one, Kate.
Right. And
at least not now. Maybe
exactly.
Maybe in the future there will be scientific discussions that are absent the current political climate influences, which will give society a better understanding for the future. That's the only thing we can hope for.
Correct. But also, you know, that outside of the political context, a lot of these outcomes are part and parcel of experiencing mass catastrophes, right? Like they're going to be there's going to be enormous damage to populations in a catastrophic situation, and that happens globally, with the spread of the virus. But as it relates to Scott's comment about emergency preparedness as it relates to pandemics, I just again want to remind people that those processes and that preparedness had been performed in the previous administration. As Les mentioned, we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, but we were already aware of SARS-CoV and MERS, and they were doing drills, pandemic drills, during the Obama administration, and it had been discussed early on that Trump threw out the pandemic playbook that Obama left for him. I think it's rich that none of these outraged senators are having Trump on the stand for, what that could have caused, what harm that in itself caused the population when we ended up facing this thing, because it had been predicted. I'm looking at an article from the Washington Post entitled "This Mock Pandemic Killed 150,000 People." Next time. Now this was in 2018, right? It is not 2019. Like this is the result of all of those drills that were covered, very extensively in the media. I saw hospitals in major cities doing these drills, and it was talked about. But I'm not a fan necessarily. Like I don't see these people necessarily as evil or a hero. I can. There's overlap in professional settings where you're bound to these processes as it relates to emergency response, disaster recovery, and post-mortem, right? So in the engineering world, say, Amazon has an outage, there's a different level of response depending on the scale of the outage. And I would imagine that the same thing applies in the area of public health. And the thing about emergency response is that you're busy responding. You're not doing your post-mortem or your root cause analysis during the response. That comes after the disaster recovery, right? Like we've gotten past the emergency itself. Now we're, now we're recovering, right? Vaccines have been disseminated, and there are less people dying, and people aren't, fine. People are getting sick, but they're not ending up in the morgue, right? It's only after all of that subsides that you do your post-mortem. So I think that it's, again, I understand the reason why Fauci is taking the fifth, because the only explanation that one can give in this situation is a professional response about processes, right? That may involve like expertise-specific language to describe the response and how things commence. But you're talking about a trial that whose only purpose is to give validation to people who don't respect expertise or scientific explanations. There really is nothing scientific that's even being discussed. There are a lot of charges, like a lot of accusations being levied against this man, but none of this is truly useful from a scientific method, a scientific perspective, or like is going to help anyone prepare for the next pandemic. And given the fact that the nature of viruses is that they mutate, there will be another one, right? And nothing that we're doing, all the money that's being spent on these hearings, none of this is going to help us prepare for the next one. So I'll land with that, because I know I can be long-winded, but this is nonsense. It's very expensive nonsense, and it doesn't prepare us for the next occurrence. Unfortunately, it's kangaroo court.
So to your point about learning from the chaos, out of the chaos comes understanding. It makes me think about blood transfusions. There is a common misconception that they emerged from war. That's not true. They were around before wars, the two world wars, but the war transformed them from what was, to that point, rare, dangerous medical curiosity into a safe mass-scale practice, because it forced the doctors to perfect and standardize the technology to save thousands of bleeding soldiers in the field. And so from the horrors of World War comes the common usage of blood transfusions that we see on a daily basis today that saves countless lives. So from the horrors of the COVID pandemic, hopefully we have learned some things that save some lives in the future. But I think we have to get over the political arguments. We got to get over that hump and on to a serious discussion. And that's what I'm looking forward to as well, King. Thank you. Very well said. El Normo, followed by Alan.
Hi there. Look, we turn to Fauci for his scientific knowledge and expertise, and he made a lot of mistakes. Remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve, or 2 weeks to stop the spread? The criticism comes because the diary reveals, and it wasn't just true of him, it was true of the people who took his advice.
He seemed to be drunk on power, frankly. And that intoxication seems to have warped his decisions and contributed to his mistakes. They did not want to, they meaning the people who made decisions like closing the parks and closing the beaches and arresting people who were outside with their family, socially distancing, watching a game, watching a kid's game, a football game or something, arresting them. There were a lot of excesses. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because it undermines and degrades our trust in our institutions. And we began to feel that these decisions were being made with a political agenda, not for the general good. And no, he didn't obviously have the power.
Are you referring, Norm, when you say that people were beginning to believe that there was a political agenda behind it. The argumentation that was made at the time that they have taken our freedoms away and that they will never be returned to us. We'll never be able to go to church again, was one of the arguments that was made. But
No,
as it
no,
turns
that's
out,
not what
that's
I'm
not.
thinking.
It turns out that those predictions were completely way off base. I guess completely and way is redundant, but you got my point.
Yeah, no, I'm not making extreme criticisms like that. I'm saying that this contributed massively to the corrosion of trust in our medical institutions. You now have anti-vax wackos, right? That came out of this because we began to see that Fauci was making mistakes, sometimes deliberately, as he did with masking. I mean, he was just untruthful.
Well, he was not alone in that assessment. The World Health Organization was also making similar assessments. There were differences in the number of feet, or in the case of the World Health Organization, meters of distance. But at that time, when those recommendations were made, this wasn't just Anthony Fauci just riding high on the power of being able to make recommendations to people and watch, to see how people are going to respond to his recommendations. This was something that not everybody, but in general, the scientific community believed at the time that the recommendations were made. And in fact, that collaboration between the United States public health officials and their colleagues around the world, in which they shared information, was ultimately cut off, at least officially, by the Trump administration because he didn't like the results of the recommendations that were coming out. This was a global pandemic, and each nation approached it a little bit differently. But in general, what Fauci recommended to the people of the United States was being recommended to people of countless countries around the world that was being visited by the COVID virus. And the recommendations there changed as the virus changed, and our knowledge of the virus changed.
Well, not with the masking. Not with the masking. That wasn't global. That was him responding to what he felt was.
I don't think so. I think in many parts of the world, masking was the norm as well. In fact,
it was the non-masking that I'm objecting to. His reversal. At first, he was not candid and recommended against masking. Then he pivoted and said,
maybe his understanding of the necessity of masking changed as it went along. Why else would he do that?
I know why.
Do you think he was thinking, well, you know what? Let's say they don't have to mask and see how many people get sick from it.
I know why he did it. He did it because he felt there was a shortage of PPE, because he said that was it. I believe all that's already come out. In any event, I like Scott's position that it's not black and white. It's not that he's a hero or an evil scientist. It's that he's a flawed person. And I like that because I think it's true. And some of his flaws were a lack of transparency about the origins of the virus. He wasn't honest about that. And that lack of honesty leads to a spreading sense of mistrust of our scientific and medical institutions. Early in the pandemic, he pointed out that he had helped set up the viral research labs in China, that he was in touch with the people that were running them. That changed after a while. He didn't mention it anymore. And he tried to sell what was, I think, a very implausible story, that this was the monstrous offspring of a pangolin and a bat. When the labs in Wuhan, the virology labs, were doing research into precisely this kind of, I think it's called a rhinovirus, And we're doing research that was, at least in colloquial terms, gain of function. He lied about that, and that there'd been security breaches. He either lied or was not candid or a little bit evasive and manipulative, and that there was security, that those labs had a history of security breaches, and that we were funding them to some extent. So at that point, he deserves criticism for lack of transparency. I don't know about these Kafka / perjury traps. I know that a couple of administrations ago, they used such a thing on Michael Flynn, and they used similar tactics on Trump when he was running for office. So I think what we're seeing is a degrading of the public discourse, an increasingly unethical, on both sides of the aisle, use of traps and gotchas in order to gain political points. So, of course, it's a political process because Congress is a political institution. But I think he should have been granted immunity and then compelled to answer honestly, so that we have, I think it was valuable, at 85, he should come clean and not just keep taking the fifth. And I think he should be granted immunity so that he can do that. I think it would enhance his legacy and reputation, which now is horribly tainted. It would also help the public discourse, and particularly confidence in our meaning-making institutions, universities, research labs, Congress, etc. Let's see if I got it. By the way, there were economically and psychologically devastating consequences to some of these mistakes. I think he should be given a pass on it. But you mentioned academic consequences to kids. I have, and also then had school-age kids, and the the psychological effects on this generation, I think, will last a lifetime. And, the public schools closed. The private schools opened pretty quickly. By the fall of 2020, they were open, the private schools. And I don't see any negative consequences that came from opening those public schools. Came from opening those private schools. And my kid missed a really good education. And, there's a wound that we're going to carry for that. I'll end it there.
So you're exactly right. In March 2020, on an interview on 60 Minutes, Fauci famously or infamously said, quote, "There's no reason to be walking around with a mask." He argued that while the masks might make people feel better, they were not providing the perfect protection people thought, and often led to people touching their faces more frequently. You're correct that he was wrong about that. How long did it take him to correct himself?
Probably as long as it took to make up some more masks, because we couldn't buy them or make them my own.
No, 3 weeks, less than a month later.
Okay.
On April 3rd, and I'm sure what happened here is that he got pushback from others in the public health sector saying, "What the hell are you talking about?" And so on April 3rd, so this was March 8th, on April 3rd, so basically 3 weeks later, Fauci said that Fauci and the CDC reversed course, recommending that all Americans wear cloth face coverings in public, and then later, of course, recommended the high quality N95 or KN95 as more contagious variants emerged. I had the benefit through all of this of knowing people in the health sector who I trust very much, who happen, by the way, to be staunch Trump-supporting Republicans. And they, throughout the pandemic, urged people to wear not just masks, but N95 or KN95 respirators, because the other cloth masks that people wearing, like, banditos robbing the stagecoach, did nothing. So in that regard, he was right. Those made people feel good. he should have been, of course, honest and say, hey, people should be wearing masks. They should be N95 masks. They're not enough to go around. And there weren't. And the concern at that time was a triaging concern. I'm not saying that he was right to mislead the public, but there was a triaging concern because even in hospitals and certainly in nursing homes, they were reusing masks, which of course you're not supposed to do. They lose their functionality if you reuse them. If you're a healthcare professional, you use the mask at the end of your shift, you discard and use another one in the beginning of your next shift. There weren't enough even for the healthcare professionals. So I think what was happening is that he was triaging the situation, but in so doing, he misled the public. You're correct. But that misleading of the public lasted for 3 weeks before he recognized the error of his strategy and he changed ways, and not just him, but the CDC as well. And so I don't know if they want to cut him off his legs off at his knees and call him Shorty because of that today. I guess you could do that. But I think that your approach to it and Scott's approach to it is a far more prudent way of looking at this error in judgment during an interview on 60 Minutes, which misled the public. And of course, in the long run, because he said one thing today and another thing tomorrow, he probably wasn't thinking that by doing so would erode confidence in the public health sector. And I think you're correct about that observation. Thank you, Norm. We'll go to Alan, followed by Daryl.
Jerry, I'm really pleased with where Norm landed his plane. I was losing my temper earlier. I think Anthony Fauci is a hero, but whether he's a hero or not is not the point. I think he has a perfect right to plead the fifth, and I think that Norm's suggestion that he be given immunity is a good suggestion. And I really want to commend people whenever they suggest something that is practical. I think we need to put this thing in context. I don't think any of this criticism of Fauci is fair. You have to remember that at the time, you had a president, the person with the largest megaphone in the world, suggesting that people take ivermectin. You had a president in the bully pulpit suggesting that people put bleach in their arms. And I think that that was pulpit abuse. Donald Trump is not like a guy in the bar or even somebody in the critical thinking forum where anybody can have an opinion. He has a specific pulpit and a specific role, and I think he abused it. And I think Fauci may have, Norm may be right that Fauci may have been a little bit wrong on some of the things he did. But I think Fauci was well-intentioned. I don't think Donald Trump is well-intentioned. And I don't think there's any doubt about that in the minds of people who look at this objectively. Now, I don't think if an endodontist wanted to do cataract surgery, it would be appropriate. Rand Paul is an ophthalmologist. He is not an infectious disease control or an allergist or an infectious disease expert. And yet, he is out there using his medical credential as justification. Rudy Giuliani was prosecuted or was removed of his license to practice law by the law community because of his abuse of the system. I think the same thing should happen to Rand Paul. He should lose his medical license. And I think if we don't begin to have some kind of credible pursuit by institutions of maintaining their particular disciplines, we're going to continue to be in trouble. So I want to land the plane there, but I would suggest that if I were an ophthalmologist and if I were in the medical profession, I would suggest that Rand Paul, because of his abuse of the pulpit, just like Donald Trump's abuse of the pulpit, he should lose his license. Thank you.
Well, he was not using the pulpit to represent himself as an ophthalmologist. He's using his pulpit to represent himself as a politician. And even if he were not a medical doctor, he would use the pulpit to go after Fauci in the manner in which he went after it. And I think we have to be very careful not to question his ability to exercise his First Amendment rights without fear of retribution for doing so, especially as a public servant, doing what he believes is the proper thing to do to represent his constituency. Even though I disagree with him, I mean, that's his right to do so. So I don't know whether, there was a president of a country in the Middle East who was an ophthalmologist as well and used chemical weapons and on his own people. That has nothing to do with his profession as an ophthalmologist. That had to do with his profession as a despotic dictator. I don't know if we should really be conflating the two, Alan.
Can I push back on you just a tad?
Of course.
I think that you make a good point. He does have First Amendment rights, just as Fauci has Fifth Amendment rights. But the problem in our society currently is that people will use their credentials in ways that don't represent their profession. And since the Congress has failed, and I think it has failed, and since the presidency has definitely failed, the professional organizations, whether they're law or medicine, are in a better position to represent their discipline than the average consumer. And my only point is there's a big difference between me giving my opinion in the critical thinking forum or sitting on a bar stool than there is for a president or for someone with a given credential. So we get very upset when ministers sexually abuse children. We should. I think this is a similar abuse of Ron Paul's discipline, and you and I can disagree about it, but I wish that at least it would be brought up by his peers, because the Republicans in Congress have completely failed us by not standing up to this president, just as I was trying to say the other day that the Democrats have failed by not standing up to the socialists, the Democratic Socialists. So I think that I'm trying to say that I'm being consistent.
To that point, your final point, you and I do not diverge, but in terms of trying to make a comparison between Rand Paul and his profession to his public comments and those attorneys who became disbarred because of their public comments, the difference is Rand Paul was speaking as a United States Senator. Those attorneys, including Rudy Giuliani and several others, were speaking as attorneys. So they were they were practicing their profession when they made unethical statements that they could not back. He's not practicing his profession. He may be leaning on the credential for credibility purposes, but that's something that people do politically all the time. There are a lot of people in Congress who we think are experts when it comes to the military because they served in the military, and maybe they are. But that doesn't mean that if they're wrong, that they should be stripped of their commissions, as somebody tried to do to a certain U.S. senator. So that's why I feel uncomfortable with suggesting that the AMA or the licensing authority in his state take a look at his license. He's not, he doesn't have a practice open anyway,
It's a thin line, Gary. I acknowledge that you're right. It's a thin line. But I just want to make the point that we are, as a society, we are in real trouble because we allow people to push the limits, and somebody has got to push back. I'm just a stupid old man in Southern California, and I can't push back. I wish someone would push back on his credentials and at least make him a little bit frightened of misusing his education. So
I think to the larger point that you made, about the internal workings of the Republican Party. I wish there were John Fettermans in the Republican Party.
Amen.
I love that John Fetterman stands up to his own party. God bless
Amen.
him for doing so.
Amen.
You know, and there should be more John Fettermans in the Democratic Party.
Amen.
But I don't think there are any really. The closest may be Susan Collins, and that's only because she'll diverge in her votes from what the president wants.
Just to win her election.
Well, for whatever her reasons, it doesn't really matter.
No.
But I don't see her on the forefront the way Fetterman is with the Democrats. It's not healthy. You know, as Norm always points out, his first responsibility is to criticize his own party. His second responsibility is to criticize the other party. Just as you, as a reformed Republican, are quick to criticize your party, and Marshall, as an active member of the Republican Party, feels comfortable criticizing his party. I think that's healthy. And as Scott, as a Democrat, feels comfortable criticizing his party. That's healthy. You know what's unhealthy? What's unhealthy is Chuck Schumer claiming to be the guardian of the Jewish people, supporting al-Sayed and saying, it's not about me, it's about winning the election. That's something I can't abide.
Agreed.
Thank you, Alan. We'll go to Daryl, followed by David.
Hey, Gary. So you know, this a lot of this is like Monday morning quarterbacking, right? So I think, were you in Jersey during COVID, Gary, or were you in Jersey at the time?
Not only was I in Jersey, but I had one of those passes that allowed me to go through the Lincoln Tunnel should my vehicle be stopped, my Uber be stopped, because I took it they gave me an Uber every day because I was considered, I don't know why, somebody made a real bad decision, but they decided I was an essential worker. So I came into the city every single day. The real essential workers were the paramedics, the nurses, the doctors, etc. I'm not an essential worker, but for some reason I was so anointed, I still kind of proudly carry that useless pass now in my wallet, just because it reminds me of, you know, what I went through. So I was living in New Jersey. I was in the city every day, 5 days a week.
So you know what I remember this because I live in a 40-story apartment building, and I remember, you know, to Norm, to something Marshall said, to something Scott said, and to something you emphasized, right? And, you know, as late as March in 2020, they were still saying, the WHO, not even our own administration, WHO was saying that COVID was not airborne. And they were telling you to avoid, remember, big droplets, you know, spray down, like you had said, spray things with bleach, blah, 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 blah. And I remember that when they first started saying, hey, this could be a problem. And I think it had something to do with a restaurant. Was it in Spain? Because Spain was one of the countries. I remember saying, okay, you know, like a lot of people here in the city, if you lived in a building like mine, or if you rode the subway, you know, by the time they said that, hey, this is airborne, you know, places that are densely populated, we were done for the most part, right? So this idea that we can now, like, what is it, like 4.5, 5 years later, go back and do this autopsy when every day it seemed like the guidance was changing. It was, you know, and Norm's right. They did say you don't need masks. And behind the scenes, they were really prepping for the worst. And I actually read Woodward's book. And I remember he said that he spoke to the president, and I think he said it was in March. And he said the president said, "No, Bob, this is going to be bad." And so they trot out Fauci, and I don't remember the woman's name, but it was Fauci and the other woman. And
Dr. Birx.
Dr. Birx, that's it. But if it weren't for the administration, we wouldn't know who Fauci was. It was actually, it was them saying, "Hey, this is the guy that is setting the policy. This is the guy that you should be listening to." And I personally think that it should have been, maybe this was not in his capacity. Maybe there was a little too much science happening. I think they could have given him a briefing. I think that leadership leads from the top down. And I think that again, Monday morning quarterbacking or 5 year later autopsying, I do find it questionable that, Fauci was given a pardon. I also remember that one of the scariest things, I remember this vividly, when they said that this was breaking out in China and they were pushing people back into their homes and locking the houses from the outside with steel. I remember saying, "Hey, there's something wrong here." And yet at the same time, we had people saying, no, this is not a big deal, or just wear a mask, or just spray peroxide on your counters. And yet, if here on the East Coast, this is a very unique situation here. We are massively densely populated. In fact, if you look at some of the spikes that had happened, the only country that had a larger spike in a short period was actually Tokyo, because people literally live on top of each other. I don't actually know anyone who was not impacted by the outbreak. I had friends lose their grandparents. I had friends lose their parents. I remember the morgue truck over at LaGuardia Hospital where they had the bodies in the back.
Yes.
But I do
when you're
still-
saying a morgue truck, let's describe it to people who don't know.
Okay.
You're talking about refrigerated semi trucks because they ran out of room at the morgue.
Yes. And candidly, my cousin Michael was in one of those trucks over at LaGuardia. He 32 years old, had asthma his entire life, but he was also in pretty good shape, did MMA, and he caught it. And, remember, it was wiping people out very quickly. Some people were like literally catching it and showing symptoms, and they were gone within a week. And I had a conversation, I'm going to pivot here. I had a conversation during the heart of the lockdown where even if you walked over to Whole Foods, they were only letting 40 people inside, and they had the 6 foot distancing lines outside. You had people lined up outside. And I had a buddy in a 3-letter agency. And I asked him, when they started talking about the Wuhan lab, I said, "Hey, what's your take on this?" He's like, "Yeah, probably." And again, this is all his opinion, but he did spend 16 years in the service. And he said, "Yeah, they probably did this." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Because what we don't understand is the reason that they do these things is what if," and he said it this way, he said, "What if China or Russia is already somewhere experimenting with this stuff, and they decide to come to New York or California and drop it in the subway, and we have no practical idea of a defense against something like this," right? So from a very pragmatic perspective, I didn't like what he was saying, but I understood his position on this. Fauci's journal, diary, whatever you want to call it, he does admit that he himself was trying to track evidence to see if this was a leak from the Wuhan lab. Now, his journal also says that he ultimately did believe that it came from the wet market or something like that. But there was a point when Trump was calling this the China virus, because we're not in the back room. We only see what they're saying when they were coming to the podium and telling us what to do. We don't know what they were talking about in the back. But we do know now, because of the journal, that Fauci himself was trying to find out if this was a lab leak. Fauci himself.
Right, but that doesn't mean that it was a lab leak. I mean, that's a prudent investigative
yes.
measure to try to determine whether it came from there.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
But what I'm also saying is publicly they were saying there's no way it was a lab leak. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like
did they say there was no way or there's no evidence?
I think Fauci at some point did say that that it was almost impossible. I'll see if I can find the quote. And again, I'm not here to talk about him. I'm simply here to say that we're here now holding an autopsy on something when it was chaos here. And when I would talk to people in Florida and they were talking about, oh, you New Yorkers, you're so extreme, you guys shut down the subway, you guys, and I'm saying, yeah, we also have a medical truck out there because we don't have.
By the way, they never really shut down the subway. They shut it down from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. It's a 24-hour subway service. They shut it down from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. and they thoroughly cleaned every piece of equipment during that period of time.
Mm-hmm. We can also talk about how at that time, that's when New York City's homeless population basically moved into the subway. I'm saying all that to say is that when people from other places like Florida, places where people just socially distance organically.
Where it's a lot less dense, right?
Yeah, it's easy to say that you're overreacting or you're this or you're that because you're not actually seeing people literally dropping dead here like they were here. I mean,
so I will tell you that during that period that we discussed in the beginning, when I'm coming into the city, and by the way, there were Uber drivers that came to my house, and then when they saw that we were going to the city, they drove away.
Mm-hmm.
They would not drive to the city. They were afraid to go to the city.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, during that period, and I'm not saying anything you don't already know, you live in the city, it was eerie because you could walk through Times Square and be the only person for blocks. Times Square.
Yes.
But there was one thing. There were no horns. There were no music blaring. There were no people screaming at one another. There were not, none of that, which we hear all the time. If you come to New York City, be prepared to be overwhelmed if it's your first trip by the sounds. There were no subways running. I mean, not after 1 a.m. There was nothing going on. There were no people saying, comedy club, what's your picture taken? Do you want to pet my snake? It's wild.
Yeah.
None of that. But there's one thing you did hear constantly. You know what the one thing you heard constantly?
No.
The sirens of EMS.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah. And people psychologically, people were afraid. People in my building, if the door opened and someone was already in the elevator, no one would get on with anybody else. I don't think
that makes it pretty rough if you're in a 40-story apartment building. Because you got a lot of exercise walking up and down the stairs. Gerald was never in better shape than he was during COVID because he had to walk 40 flights of stairs to go to work. Oh my God!
And you're picking and choosing your food better because you don't even want. I actually consider the food delivery services essential here in the city as well. I know they're not necessarily saving lives, but they were bringing food.
No, today they're taking lives by running them over with their e-bikes. But that's another story. I got to move on. Thanks, Farrell. David, followed by Linda.
I thought Meryl was dead.
Hey, hello, Gary. Yeah, I mean, the Fauci beatdown on the Hill. I mean, obviously, I wish they would apply the same, zealous interrogation as they would on the Epstein perpetrators. But that's for another story. But yeah, I mean,
Wow. Wow. That's a good one. No, that's a good one. That's excellent. Why the hell aren't they up there screaming and hollering about the Epstein files?
Yeah.
They're going to, because Cassidy folded today. They are going to, in all likelihood, confirm Todd Blanche as Attorney General, and there may be reasons for it. There may be reasons, but the Epstein victims are adamant that this guy it sends the wrong message because of the preferential treatment that Ghislaine Maxwell is getting, and the cover-up of the volumes and volumes and volumes of files under his watchful eye, that he ought not to be Attorney General. Nobody's screaming and hollering. I don't hear Rand Paul holding his feet to the fire.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really a good point that you bring up. But go ahead. I don't mean to allow you to allow me to digress.
Yeah. No. But is this another look over here? Ball hiding. Distraction. Political football. Enemy number one. But yeah, I think ultimately though, if we were to really do a deep dive on this, this wholly lies with the Chinese Communist Party with regard to how they suppressed evidence right out of the gate, how they shut down their whistleblowers and their doctors, even though some of these guys disappeared. They went markets instead of allowing the WHO and its investigators to examine the evidence of those markets. They went in there and they cleaned house. They sanitized the markets. They shut everybody down, put everybody out of business, and that's massive evidence that wasn't allowed to see the light of day. And many have argued that as the Chinese people have risen economically, they've had more money. The middle class has risen to enjoy these wild exotic animals that are traded on these markets. I don't know if anybody's ever been to a night market in Asia or anywhere that you see the types of foods that are there and what they like to eat. It's very plentiful. And there's a shame factor as well with regard to China and hiding this information. The massive reparations that the world would call upon for them to pay if in fact they could pin this down at their feet with regard to the Wuhan leak would be massive. I mean, even over here in our country, Gary, we've had lawsuits leveled against the country. A $24 billion judgment was upheld by a judge. I believe a couple of states like Missouri and Mississippi also sued. And then, of course, we saw what happened to the Australian government when they tried to hold China to account. They went ahead and tariffed the hell out of all their products and retaliated. And they took this response absolutely serious, and they used their own form of wolf diplomacy to scare other countries from coming at them. And so, Gary, I think ultimately the answers lie somewhere in the destroyed data by the government. They also erased and destroyed 22,000 viruses that were being researched. And so this is all stuff Fauci had no control over. When the WHO investigators went over to Wuhan, they were bullied by the Chinese Communist Party. This is an authoritarian response to a national, international massive outbreak. And they were forced to kind of like tone down their reports and not able to see all the evidence. So, Fauci just probably did what he had to do in the moment that he had to do them. And I mean, look, at the end of the day, he's not God. He's not, he's just a scientist, obviously looking at the data like everybody else. And, these Republican senators, Rand Paul included, with their libertarian ideals, just saw a guy go rogue on the whole nation and shut down schools. And now he's the boogeyman. He's the face of all the bad things that we suffered through. And I don't know that you can pin that down on one guy, given the massive scale and severity of what it was we were facing. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, the answers lie somewhere in China, and the Chinese Communist Party is not going to let that out or let that reach the light of day, in my opinion. But that's what we're dealing with when you're dealing with these authoritarian, autocratic nations that don't have to play by our rules, don't necessarily have to follow our science, our courts, when it comes to them having to be accountable for what they've done. I mean, we have the same issue over here, Gary, with regard to the size and scope of our corporations. One of the things I did not like about the rollout of the vaccines was granting these pharmaceutical companies immunity from lawsuits. If they're so confident in what it is they want me to prick myself with, well, then they should allow me to sue if I'm named by the actual vaccine. And I had friends who wouldn't take it for that very reason. I had friends who said, "Hey, man, if I get hurt and I can't sue, then I'm not going to do it. I'd rather roll the dice." So I think we learned a lot, Gary, from all.
See, that's funny. If I get hurt and I can't sue, I'm not going to take it. But if I don't take it and I get the virus and I die, I still can't sue. I can't sue.
Right. No, I know. I get it.
I mean, that's not a logical approach to it, David.
It's not logical for me, but these are the people that voted for Trump. And they view Fauci as enemy number one. Gary, I can't debate. You can't debate these people sometimes. I had a guy saying, "I'm all loaded up on ivermectin, and I'm going to take that drug if I get sick, and I know I'm going to be healed." So I mean, look, this is the problem when facts, what we don't celebrate enough, Gary, and I appreciate Les bringing up the lives that can be pinned at Fauci's feet with regard to the HIV and others. But there's guys before him, Linus Pauling and the polio vaccine guy, was it Salk? Jonas Salk. Yeah, these are guys, Gary, that had to run test after test until they finally got it right. And we all got vaccinated and growing up in middle schools and stuff, and nobody ever came down with measles, mumps, rubella, or polio. And now all of a sudden, this vaccine is the cause of all things autism and all these things impacting a lot of these children today. And so I think the narrative and the talking points are really outside the sphere of honest science now. I think we're in a whole nother basket case.
I think you're right. The politics have overtaken the science. Thank you, David. I'm going to move on because of the time. Thank you. Appreciate that. Linda, followed by Ben.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Gary. I was waiting for you to call me. I have long COVID, so I feel very passionately about this. I can't help it because of my experience. I got COVID in 2020, and it was before the vaccine was available to my demographic. So I got really, really sick. And I'm still dealing with lingering symptoms. Fatigue is the worst one, just as pervasive exhaustion. And I have an issue called POTS with my heart, where my heart rate beats very fast. My blood pressure drops at random times. So
I know exactly what that is. Linda, one of my best friends growing up has it.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry you got it.
Thank you. So I've been dealing with long COVID for over 5 years now, and it was not from due to the vaccines, due to the virus. I was very ill, but it did take a political turn, and I think that really affected people. I took some notes. I think one of the things was that the science was changing, and as public health officials and scientists learn more about the virus, this ever-changing information, I think it really confused people when they told people. I remember when they said, do not go out and buy a mask, you don't need a mask, and then 3 weeks later, you need to get a mask, and there were no masks, and they had to make the makeshift masks. I remember people were advised to stock up on so much food in case you were to get sick and you couldn't leave the store, so it caused like the panic buying, the vaccine mandates, the mask, mandates. But overall, like, I think Dr. Fauci, probably looking back on the whole pandemic, I'm sure there's things that he regrets or things he wish he could have changed, but the bell's already been rung. We can't go back in time. I think realizing that this virus was very serious, over 1 million people died here in the United States and millions of people globally, worldwide. I think people are very angry that they had to deal with the lockdown. I think they're angry that they missed this portion of their life. People are angry that they lost their jobs because they didn't get, they chose not to get the vaccine or whatever, or they're angry because maybe they lost their job due to COVID, probably couldn't have to get a different kind of job. I mean, it was horrible, the lockdowns, being in social isolation. I think people are angry about that, and they're wanting to come at Dr. Fauci. It's kind of like a witch hunt mentality. What I feel about Dr. Fauci is I don't think he's a bad guy. I think he did the best that he could. I think he worked in the best interest of the people based on the science as it was ever changing. I think Trump made the situation much worse because he was downplaying the virus, saying it would magically disappear by summer, calling it the Kung flu and the China virus, and making the joke that people could, inject bleach and all that stuff. And I think he made the problem worse. There was also 12 people, I don't know if you ever looked them up, they're called the Disinformation Dozen. And in fact, some of them were on Clubhouse, but there were 12 people in the beginning of the pandemic that were responsible for disseminating about 80% of the misinformation online about the COVID-19 vaccine. The last thing I want to say,
they were active on Clubhouse?
Yeah, they were. It was Steve Kirsch was one of them. I forget I don't know if Dr. McCullough was on there, but there were 2 or 3 of them that were on Clubhouse. But I know Steve Kirsch was one of them, and he was spreading a ton of misinformation about the COVID vaccines. With that being said, I don't wish anyone to get long COVID. It has been the worst experience of my life. It has cost me thousands of dollars in medical care, non-FDA approved treatments, herbs, just every kind of thing you can think of to try to get better. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, and also conventional medications, pharmaceuticals. So I really don't wish that upon anybody. And I would encourage you all to, get vaccinated because it does greatly reduce your chances of unfortunately getting long COVID. I also think Dr. Fauci could have said more about long COVID and could have warned people more about it, but he did speak on it. But at the same time, I think they were busy just dealing with the whole pandemic overall. But there are, millions of Americans still dealing with long COVID and still dealing with these side effects, and then, obviously the people that died. So I take this very hard. I very to heart. I take this very seriously. I'm very passionate about it, and I just think to sit there and try to take him on this hearing, I think it's a waste of time. And I feel like, him saying, pleading to the fifth or whatever to not incriminate himself, I think that's a smart thing to do. Also, I feel like maybe he feels, I don't know, I can't speak for him, I'm thinking maybe his mind, maybe he feels like, why do I need to explain myself to these people? We were living in a global pandemic. And I don't know if anyone could have done a better job of managing a global pandemic, because the last one we had that was global that created so much chaos was, there was like SARS, that wasn't as many people. There was the flu, like the H1N1, and things like the swine flu, but that still didn't affect as many people. I think the major one before that would have been, there's like the polio scare, and then there was the Spanish, the Spanish influenza. I think that was the last major like global pandemic that caused chaos, and that was in 1918.
Yeah, that was the last major one.
So, what'd you say?
That was the last major one.
Yeah, so they made mistakes. I'm sure there were tons of mistakes made in that pandemic as well. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your time, and I'm sorry that you're suffering from long COVID. I know somebody else who's suffering from it, and it's not fun. The Disinformation Dozen, I had not heard of them. According to the NPR, It's a group of 12 prominent online influencers identified by the nonprofit Center for Countering Digital Hate as being responsible for up to 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation shared on Facebook and Twitter, and I guess Clubhouse, during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And guess who one of those 12 is, ladies and gentlemen? I bet you Les knows. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Dr. Mitch, followed by Beth. Dr. Mitch, Dr. Mitch, Dr. Mitch. Short on time. Ben, followed by Well.
Okay, so Gary, I guess were you not on Clubhouse in 2020 or 21? I'm sorry, I don't remember when you started getting on Clubhouse. Maybe you missed the golden age of Clubhouse, including some of those 12 people that are actually having large rooms spreading information that's incorrect. But anyway, but just on that point, misinformation. I think it's one thing to spread misinformation, but it's a worse thing to spread disinformation. For example, some of those individuals that are asking people not to get vaccinated, they themselves got vaccinated. They were saying, oh, vaccine will make you worse, it's gonna kill you or blah, blah, blah. Yet they and their family members, kids and wives and husbands, they went to get the vaccine. It is really, to me, beyond just being ignorant, not understanding the science, and then ask people to be cautious about the vaccine. And there were quite a few of those individuals, even individuals, I believe, that were probably even in government position. I don't remember who the names were, but certainly some powerful people that did that. Back to the topic of the room, I have quite a bit to say, but obviously it's late for you. I will make it short, but it's a very heavy topic. And even 2026, the amount of ignorance that's showing up on our general public, even in this room, it's just deafening. It's like the silence is, what is that phrase? The silence is deafening. I think I feel the same way. It's even more jarring to see Congress is actually coming down on Fauci. Whether Fauci did anything bad, intentionally or unintentionally, I think historians will probably discuss that. But the lessons that we needed to discuss, to learn, is completely forgotten by these congressional powerhouse individuals. Name one of them would be if the government's response policies, whether there's anything that we can learn and correct ourselves in the future, not to repeat those mistakes. And when I say government, I think I include both Biden and Trump. There is so much information, so many lessons that we can learn. And now they're spending their time forcing Fauci to testify, having learned that he has the constitutional right to plead the fifth. By the way, as a legal nerd, I'm interested in learning whether the Supreme Court, whether the Justice Department will take up this case, meaning once one is granted a pardon by a president, it can